In this video, we will cover adding and removing vendors. This will also help you if you need to change which price list you're on for a certain vendor. The first step is to log in as an administrator. Once you've done that, go ahead and click the admin button and go to vendors. This will bring up the list of vendors that you have currently added in XOLights. Removing a vendor is very simple. All you have to do is click the remove button to the right of the vendor. Now, adding a vendor is done at the bottom of the page. You can see XO supported vendors and customer maintained vendors. The difference between the two is the XO supported vendors are the ones maintained by our data team, and the customer supported vendors are ones added and maintained by other XOLights showrooms. We're going to focus on the XO supported vendors right now. First, we'll click on the drop down here to see which vendors are in there. Then you simply scroll through to find the vendor that you want to add. Once you've found your vendor, go ahead and highlight them and click Add Vendor. This will take you to the Edit Vendor page. The most important thing on this page is to add in your account number. There are a couple of reasons why this is so important. First, this aids in vendor communication. We use it to verify with the vendor that you have permission to display their data on your site. This can prevent problems down the road with the vendor. You also have the option of adding in your vendor rep information. This is optional, however, if you choose to add it, it can act as a resource for your salespeople. They would be able to access that information from the item sales info pages, which you access from the item details page. Down here you have your base cost multiplier. This can be used to change the dealer's net in the system. For example, if you consistently pay 10% freight for a vendor, you may change your base cost multiplier to 1.1 so that the cost that you see in the system is taking into account that extra. If you're a Canadian showroom, you may use the base cost multiplier to account for the exchange rate as well as any custom payments you have to account for to get the products to your showroom. Next, we have the vendor discount. You can use this for any type of discount you get from the vendor. You just type in the whole amount of the discount. Now, this field has another important use, and that is in the case of retail-only vendors. There's only a handful of these in the system, for example, Tech Lighting, Besa, LBL, and a number of others. These vendors do not supply dealer's net. Instead, they will supply retail pricing and tell you how much to discount off of retail to get to your own pricing. For example, they may say you get 50% off of retail to get your costs, in which case you would just enter 50%. In the event that the vendor gives you more than one number, for example, they may say you get 50 plus 10, which typically means 50% off and then 10% off of the remaining 50%. When you work out the math on that, it comes out to 55%, and that would be the number that you enter into the vendor discount field. The next field I want to cover is web-enabled. This will control whether or not this vendor shows up on the internet. If you uncheck the web-enabled box, the vendor will not display on the internet or to your customers. However, when you log in as an administrator or a salesperson, you will be able to access the vendor's products and see pricing. Account enabled is kind of the same thing but relates to trade accounts such as contractors and designers. If this box is unchecked, your trade accounts will not see the vendor's products when they are logged in. Next, we have the pricing policies. What appears in this drop-down will depend on which vendor you're looking at because each vendor has different policies. The four major policies that we deal with here are IMAP, UMAP, UMRP, and MSRP. So looking at this drop-down, I can tell DecoBreeze has both IMAP and MSRP because there are choices on those in the list. Now let's talk about what these different policies mean. First of all, IMAP is the Internet Minimum Advertised Price. That means that's the lowest you can advertise that item on the internet. Next, you have the UMAP, which is very similar to IMAP. It is the Unilateral Minimum Advertised Price, and that means it's not just covering the internet, it is also covering the showroom. So it is the lowest you can advertise the products either place. The interesting thing about MAP policies is that they are specifically for advertised pricing. They're not necessarily the lowest that you can sell it at. You just can't display a price lower than IMAP or UMAP. UMRP, however, is a little bit different. UMRP stands for the unilateral minimum retail price. That is the lowest you can sell that product for, period. The last policy is MSRP, and that stands for manufacturer's suggested retail price. This is suggested retail and is typically not enforced. For those of you who are unfamiliar with pricing policies, it is the vendor who enforces these policies. Typically, if you're in violation of their policies, which would happen if your pricing is lower than the permitted pricing, they would give you a warning initially and ask you to fix the situation immediately. If you fail to comply, then they will move to other consequences. Frequently, that will end your relationship with the vendor and you will no longer be able to purchase from them. We strongly recommend that you do stay within the vendor's pricing policies such as IMAP, UMAP, and UMRP. Now let's talk about how to set different pricing policies. Let's look at this IMAP policy right here. It says 1,039 out of 1,039. What that means is out of the 1,039 items that Deco Breeze currently has in the catalog, all of them have an IMAP policy. Now, that's not true for their MSRP. You can see down here, only 591 items have an MSRP policy. It's not uncommon for vendors' pricing policies not to cover all of their items. For example, many parts and discontinued items do not have pricing policies applied to them. Now let's talk about the difference between minimum and actual. When you set a pricing policy as actual, that is the price that will be used. So for example, IMAP as actual would set you right at IMAP. If you're trying to be competitive with internet pricing, you'll know that IMAP and UMAP pricing tend to be what everyone is advertised at because that's the lowest you can go and that keeps you competitive. So if you are trying to stay within that competitive market, IMAP as actual is going to be your ideal setting. If there's no IMAP policy, then UMAP as actual or even UMRP as actual can be used as well. Now let's talk about what minimum means. When you set a pricing policy as minimum, it's going to refer to your markups, whatever they are, as long as they don't go below the vendor's pricing policy. Let me give you an example. Let's say that the vendor's pricing policy is a 2.0 markup, and I have set this vendor in my system as a 1.8. In that case, my pricing policy would be below IMAP, so the system will bump up the pricing to be to that 2.0. Let's say that it was the opposite. Let's say that the vendor's pricing policy is still a 2.0, but my markup that I set is a 2.2. Because 2.2 would not be in violation of the vendor's pricing policy, it would allow me to keep my 2.2 markup. Now the default here, set available as minimum, is going to look for IMAP, UMAP, UMRP, and if it finds either of those three, it will set those as the minimum. That's just because we want to keep you safe from going below IMAP. Now you may have noticed here there's a difference between the web pricing policy and the store pricing policy. The reason for that is because some people like to set their web pricing different than they do their in-store pricing. If that's the case, then you can set the policies however you want for web pricing versus in-store pricing. If you want to keep your pricing the same for the web and in-store, then you'll want to just set the web pricing policy and the store pricing policy to the same settings. The difference between the web pricing and the in-store pricing is that you will see the web pricing when you're logged out, whereas when you log in as an administrator or salesperson, you're going to see the in-store pricing. That's so the salespeople who are showing people around the showroom or going through items with them with the online catalog will be able to display the in-store pricing that the customer will be purchasing at. The last thing on this page that I want to show you is the vendor rank. This will control which vendors show up first in the list. One way to go about this that has proven very effective is to take a rating scale such as 1 through 3 or 1 through 5, depending on how many vendors you have, and take your very best vendors and rate them as 1, and then your second best is 2, and so on. Of course, you can use any scale that you want to from 1 to 99. What happens then is when the customer does a search, it will pull up the results from your vendors marked 1 that fit those search requirements and have those mixed in together. Once the customer has searched through the ones, it will hit the twos and then the threes and so on. That way you can press the vendors that work the best with you to the very top, and the ones that are maybe a little more difficult to work with or you don't get as good of margins on to the bottom of the search results. Once you have your settings how you want them, you can go ahead and hit Submit Vendor. I'm going to go ahead and add an account number in here so we can do this. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit Submit Vendor. And right now you can see it says initializing. This is fairly normal. What it means is it's working on transferring the data over from the main database to your site. That usually doesn't take very long. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page to see if that's completed. Now that it has completed, you can see it says verified. Verified is good. That's what you want to see. The other thing that you might see besides initializing and verified is pending. There are a couple of reasons that you may see pending on your site. First of all, if you've left the account number blank for a vendor, the vendor will go to pending and that data will not come across. The other reason is because some vendors require an authentication process. For example, right here I have Sterling Industries. You can see that this is an XOLights maintained vendor, and I have my account number here, but it's still gone to pending. The reason for that is because Sterling and several other vendors require that we first get permission from them to turn on their data for your site. You simply contact the vendor and ask them to send us notification either through an email, fax, or even a letter that says that you have permission to display their data on your site. Now let's talk for a second about different price sheets. For example, here you see I have Elk Cornerstone yellow and Sterling Industries green and Siegel gray. A lot of vendors will have names like that have colors or some other sort of indicator after them. That's because some vendors have multiple price scales. Which pricing scale you're on will depend on your relationship with the vendor. If you're not sure which pricing scale you're on, you can check the color of your actual price sheet that you've received from the vendor. If that doesn't tell you what you need to know, your rep should be able to clarify for you which pricing scale you should be on. Make sure that when you add a vendor, you're adding the correct pricing scale. Sometimes you may find yourself in a position where you need to change which pricing scale is displaying. For example, if I had added Siegel Gray and then my rep told me that I was really supposed to be on the yellow price sheet, all I have to do is hit remove here to take the gray price sheet off and then come down to the bottom of the page here where it says add a vendor and find the yellow price sheet and add that in just like we talked about earlier in this video. That would allow me to start seeing the new pricing scale within a couple of minutes in most cases. So this has been a video on how to add or remove vendors in XOLights. If you have any further questions, please feel free to access any of our additional training materials or to contact our client services team at clientservices@xolights.com.